All right, we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Crowdcast here with Techstars. We had a couple events today, so hopefully you're ready for our next event here. I am Casey. I'm going to be helping to lead and moderate this event with you. If you are watching, go ahead and shout out where you are tuning in from in the chat box. I'm here in Boulder, Colorado. Also, anytime throughout the broadcast, you can go ahead and submit a question below our faces. There's an Ask a Question box. Our speaker, we have some slides, and then we'll take questions from you. Today, we're talking about fundraising and creating an inclusive environment for fundraising and an inclusive experience. So should be an awesome conversation. And so hopefully you learned something, and go ahead and get those questions in, and we'll get to them as we can. And I'm going to pass it over to our speaker, JP, today for a little intro about himself.
Cool. So I'm actually just going to start sharing my slides because that's part of my presentation. Quick technical question. So I don't see their faces.
No, so we are the only ones on the stage right now. So we are broadcasting live, and they'll be in the chat talking to us and each other.
Got you. So I'm really looking at you. So can you see my screen?
Yes. Yep.
Cool. Fantastic. All right. So let's jump right into this. So just real quick to kind of like give people a sense of what we're going to be covering and format for today. So I want to use kind of like the first half of the time to go through some material with you. First and foremost, introduce myself, then go into the topic at hand of raising capital. And then I want to use the second part to really have a conversation with the different people who are currently in attendance. Couple of things for people to keep in mind. I'm really going to be speaking mostly from my personal experience and founders in my network, Black founders, women founders. So don't take this as like a scientific fact or research. And like one of my investors always used to tell us, opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one. So this is really my opinion. The other thing I want to mention is that the intent of this is really to invite everybody to participate because this is obviously like a big topic, amongst many other challenges we face as a tech community, as a society, as a nation, as a world. So keep in mind that's my ultimate goal, right? Is to really try to be as sincere as possible for us to have a very kind of like honest and engaging conversation that hopefully moves us towards action. So with that said, let's jump right in. Let me introduce myself to those who don't know me and give you a little bit of background. So my name is Jean-Pierre Adechi. So I was born in Benin in West Africa, grew up in New York City, came to New York as a kid, went to school at the Lycée Français de New York, which is the French school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So graduated from there, high school, did my freshman year of college at Wesleyan University, which is in Middletown, Connecticut, small liberal arts school. Unfortunately, I had to drop out after freshman year for financial reasons because at the time, my father had lost his job and my parents were not going to be able to afford the $40,000 plus tuition that it was or whatnot. So came back to New York City. I couldn't transfer to another university because I still owed Wesleyan $10,000. So they were not going to release my transcript. And so I started working jobs here and there in restaurants, as a busser, as a waiter, temping for companies. The mindset at the time was, let me do whatever I have to do to pay back this debt and finish my undergrad studies. Long story short, I quickly realized that with those type of jobs, there was no way I was going to be able to cover the cost of living in New York, pay back my debt to Wesleyan, and then eventually be able to pay for my undergrad studies. So that's what led me at 19 to launch my first business, which was Touche de Finesse. It was a high-end French catering service. Launched it with two buddies from high school who had gone on to do culinary studies. Again, giving you the story in brief, but we're able to scale that business up to doing contractual event work with the likes of the United Nations And we're doing more like higher end, so like fancy sit down dinners, cocktail soirees for like fashion shows, French American Chamber of Commerce, you name it. Touche de Finesse allowed me to pay back my debt to Wesleyan. It also helped me pay for my undergrad studies that I finished at Baruch, which is a city university here in New York City. After that, I went on to co-found a film production company called Authorized Dealer Films, again with another friend from high school, Jeffrey Jean-Baptiste. And there again, we're able to successfully scale that business up to doing cool contractual work with the likes of Dr. J, Converse, Questlove from The Roots, Usher, the R&B singer. We did our own film festival, the ABCD Film Festival, that was sponsored by Jameson, which was great. It was covered by all the local papers, New York Times, New York Post. And more importantly, for me personally, the success of the production company showed me that, I guess at the time I wasn't too sure whether I got lucky with the catering company or whether there was something that I genuinely understood about the process of you take an idea, you build a team around it, then you bring a product or service to market that other people are going to pay you for. And so being able to do it again with the production company was kind of like a checkbox for myself that, for one, I love doing this, building businesses. But for two, like, I think I understand this process quite well. Fast forward, I go away to Europe. I use a very early version of what today is the French unicorn BlaBlaCar. Their early beta version was called covoiturage.fr. Small, it was a carpooling, or it is a carpooling platform in Europe, the leading carpooling platform, worth over €1 billion. And so I used it to get around Spain and France, and I thought it was super cool. And I was thinking, how come we don't have something like this here in the US? And so that's the beginning of Wheelie. And essentially with Wheelie, what we're looking to do is build the biggest transportation network in America by focusing on the 25-minute plus trip segment, understanding that anything that's less than 25 minutes, that's Uber and Lyft territory. We're not competing in that space. And the way that we wanted to go about it was by starting with the college market. And so when you look at a map of US campuses and colleges, you realize that most kids in America don't go to an NYU or a Boston University. Most kids in America go to Texas A&M, a UMass Amherst, a University of Vermont, basically big state and private universities that are in the boonies, right, in the middle of nowhere. But what's interesting is that when you overlay that map with US highways, you realize that these universities are always in proximity of a key highway or interstate route. And so that's the relationship that we were leveraging to build out our transportation network. And we wanted to use the college market, similar to Facebook, to then transition to the general population. We were able, with Wheelie, to raise close to 1.5 million, went through the Techstars program, the mobility program in Detroit, got some great investors on board, even some superstar investors. We're able to scale it to about 18 campuses, mostly in the Northeast of the US. At our bigger size, we're about a team of 8 or 9 individuals. Earlier this year, I initiated another round of fundraising. We had figured out a repeatable and scalable customer acquisition strategy, and we wanted to basically replicate this and bring Wheelie to the Midwest and down South. We are going through the fundraising process in deep diligence for a couple of VC firms. And then, as you know, COVID starts grabbing headlines in early March, and fundraising is hard. And I'm going to go into that topic. But basically, when COVID came around, it really killed all our investor conversations because the VCs and investors we were talking to told us that we're not going to deploy capital and travel at this moment. You want to wait and see kind of what happens. Plan B was, let's go and use the little bit of revenue we have to launch new markets. It's going to be slow, but we knew what we were doing. So we wanted to open up Wisconsin in March, but then come end of March, universities start going virtual, which basically killed any capacity we had at the time to generate revenue. So fast forward to today. Unfortunately, we had to shut down Wheelie. I'm at the tail end of that process of shutting down the company, dealing with the legal and administrative side of things right now. And so what I'm doing now is I'm being invited by platforms like Techstars to talk about my experience as a Black founder, raising capital in what's mostly white male dominated tech world. I am also getting some consulting projects that work in the space of building repeatable and scalable customer acquisition strategies, working with innovation teams with large corporates, also starting to do some work around diversity and equity and inclusion. And the third thing I'm doing is thinking about my next move, my next venture. So I'm fortunate enough that I'm getting approached with offers that I'm doing my diligence on. I also have a couple of ideas of my own, but I am not rushing the process because, like I like to say, I don't want to jump from one marriage. So that's the background on me. But I guess enough about me. Let's jump into the subject at hand, which is raising capital. So the first thing that I kind of want to highlight on this topic of raising capital is talking about how it looks like from the outside looking in. And the first thing I want to mention is what I like to refer to as the hamster wheel. So too often, right, and I made this mistake myself, entrepreneurs, as soon as they have an idea, the first reflex they have is, or even an MVP, let me go and raise capital in order to bring this thing to life. And it's an appealing offer, right? The idea that someone else is going to give you capital in order for you to build a company, build a business, and build out your vision. But there's couple of challenges that come with it. Investors give you capital in order for you to deploy it, to not sit on it. And so essentially what occurs is that you go out, you raise capital, you start spending this capital to grow your business, recruit individuals, spend on marketing, spend on user acquisitions or developing your product. And so you get into a space where you're spending more money and incurring more costs than you are generating revenue. And essentially what that means is that you're basically 6 months, 12 months, hopefully 18 months away from being right back out there looking to raise capital again. And that's what I call it, the hamster wheel, right? Because essentially a lot of CEOs, founders will tell you it ends up being very time consuming. And so, the question then becomes, why do so many of us have this reflex, right, of wanting to go and raise capital as soon as we build this MVP and have an idea? I think the media plays a significant role in that, right, through the narratives that they promote. And so, whether you're looking at your email inbox today, right, you probably have or notifications from the New York Times or the TechCrunch or the Crunchbase or the Wall Street Journal. And you tend to always see headlines that kind of go like this, right? So-and-so company or so-and-so individuals just raised this amount of money, right? And essentially, like when you're constantly kind of getting exposed to this narrative and the importance that's given to raising capital, it starts to depict this image that, for one, it must be the thing to do. And then also it looks like everybody else is doing it, right? Which brings me to my third point about unicorns. And a quote that I like to illustrate this is one from the Bad Boys movie, the first one, where Will Smith's character, Mike Lowry, at some point in the flick, basically says, everybody wants to be like Mike. Right, kind of like comparing himself to Michael Jordan. And I think it's the same case. It's the same thing here, right? Like we hear the stories, we see the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Jeff Bezos, the Travis Kalanick's of the world, and we want to be like them. It looks glamorous. The level of success, the capacity to raise so much capital, the capacity to grow a business is super appealing. So it tends to be kind of like the path that we decide to pursue. But here's the reality. Raising capital is extremely hard for everybody, regardless. For those of you that have worked in sales, you'll identify with this. Raising capital is a full-time job, right? It's like working in sales where you have to build your funnel, you have to build your prospects, you have to spend time getting the introduction, setting up the initial call, going through your entire process of due diligence with each investor or group of investors. So it's essentially super time consuming. And for CEO, you quickly realize, as much as you don't want to, and as much as you see it happen, that you start spending the majority of your time really pitching and fundraising and not necessarily acquiring customers and developing your product or working on your vision. The second thing about raising capital I think is super important to keep in mind is that it is emotionally and psychologically painful, extremely painful. And one example that I like to use to kind of like illustrate this is, imagine you're going on 100 dates and, 90 of the people or the individuals that you're going to go on a date with are going to tell you flat out like, hey, you're ugly. I'm not attracted to you. You're unattractive. Maybe 5 or 7 entertain the idea of that second date. And then maybe ultimately 1, right, says yes. And so the reason I use this as an example is to say that, like, I don't care how confident you are or how much you believe in yourself, you're going to take a beating. And that's because of the nature of the majority of the time you're exposed to no. And, some no's are more or less polite, some no's more or less professional. So it's an extremely frustrating process. The last key thing I want to mention about fundraising that makes it extremely difficult is that it's not a merit-based system. And I can't stress this enough. Like, it's not because you start fundraising that you're going to be able to fundraise. It's not because you spend a lot of time fundraising that you're going to be able to fundraise. And it's not because you work hard at it that you're going to be able to fundraise. So we hear a lot of the stories that people do it successfully, but don't assume that everybody who initiates or starts that exercise is able to successfully accomplish it. And as I go into the next slide, you're going to see that I'm going to contradict myself, but it's something that happens often. And so why do some people succeed at fundraising? The first thing to keep in mind is that FOMO is real, right? Like the fear of missing out. And a quote that I like to illustrate this is a quote from Warren Buffett. I was watching Warren Buffett on the Charlie Rose show like years ago. And he said something that just really stuck with me. And I wrote that quote down somewhere. Warren Buffett says, and I'm going to paraphrase, he goes, human beings throughout history make a lot of technological progress, societal progress, but there are a couple of things, right, about human beings that does not change, right? Because Charlie Rose is asking him about his investment philosophy. And one of those 2 things he mentions is fear and greed. And he goes on to explain how they are such powerful emotions in our decision-making process. And it's the same thing here. Investors will invest in your company if they fear that they are not going to get the opportunity to invest later down the line at a future time or in a future round. And so founders, CEOs that are good at fundraising know how to kind of create that sense of urgency and create that FOMO. But cautionary tale here, investors know, right, that founders are trying to create that urgency and FOMO. So the best rate of creating urgency is really it being real, right? In the sense that like your round is closing and there's such an appetite for your round that people are going to act on it, because you don't want to be put in a situation where, and I've definitely done that mistake where you're like, hey, I'm closing my round next week or next month. And then next week or next month comes around and the round is still open and you're right back, contacting that investor like, hey, I could still use some of that capital if you're still interested, which you don't want to do because eventually, right, that impacts your credibility. The second thing I want to mention about why do some people succeed at fundraising is herd mentality. We're human beings. People follow. Again, I'm sure you guys read in the press the quote unquote hot trends, right? And this pandemic has also put forward some of the trending spaces that investors want to invest in, and people follow those, right? And so if you're building a company or you have a service that happens to be in one of those spaces that's kind of like top of mind for most people, and they're hearing about constantly throughout the media or the press, then yeah, there's a high likelihood that people are going to be interested in your deal and people are going to want to participate. The third thing I want to mention, which I think is actually the most important reason why some people succeed at fundraising, is because of trust. And so when we went through the Techstars program, and our managing director, Ted Serbinsky, and shout out to Ted, we had a session where we really focused on how do you build trust, right? And a simple exercise you guys could kind of do on your own is think about people you know, and think about some of these individuals coming to you asking you for, I don't know, $100, $50, $100,000, regardless of the amount, right? You're going to do a quick calculation, right, when this person asks you for the money to assess whether or not you want to lend them money based on whether you believe they're going to pay you back. Investors do the same thing, right? They try to evaluate whether they're going to get a return on that investment that they make. So if you think about it from a spectrum standpoint, like, and on your extreme left, you have friends and family, and on your extreme right, you have that acquisition, that IPO. People from your friends and family are really going to give you money because of you, because they trust you. They might like the idea, but ultimately, that's what they're really judging. And so down the line, right, as you move through the process of scaling up your company, what tends to happen, but again, there are real life examples right now that contradict what I'm saying, is that your business metrics more and more matter, right, at that Series B, that Series C investment, where it's no longer so much about you as an individual, but really what has your business proven when it comes to metrics. And which brings me to my next point. A key thing, and which also contradicts what I said before about fundraising not being merit-based, is a key thing that would allow you to fundraise are extraordinary KPIs. And I really want to stress the extra part of ordinary, because we're not talking about good KPIs. We're not talking about great KPIs. We're really talking about extraordinary KPIs. And so this is a situation where you're seeing your key performance indicators or key business metrics that are growing and moving in the right direction so fast, right, that investors will kind of be like, hey, I want to invest in this company today, and we'll worry about the details and they might pass on doing that more detail-oriented due diligence because they're worried that other investors are going to come in and kind of snatch this deal away, which goes back to my first point of FOMO. And so with fundraising being hard as it is, it's even harder if you're a Black founder, if you're a woman founder, if you're in a minority founder. So these are numbers that I pulled out from a Crunchbase report and article. And the numbers kind of speak for themselves, right? Like less than 10% of VC dollars go to women founders, less than 1% goes to Black founders. And what's interesting is that, in that report, they look at, the profile of the majority of VC partners out there. And don't quote me on the number, but it is up there. I believe, if I remember correctly, it's about 90 plus VC partners are white men who went to Stanford and Harvard, right? And then when you look at the companies that receive VC capital, it's about 70 plus, right, have a white male founder who went to Stanford and Harvard. So again, right, like when you look at the numbers, you really realize that this is not a subjective opinion. There is clearly something that's at play here from a behavioral standpoint. And going back to my previous slide, people getting money based on trust, there are different ways to build trust. And some people are able to rely on their social networks or sometimes their university networks or professional networks to do this. And so what are some of the components, in my opinion, or some of the factors, I should say, that make it harder for minority founders and women founders to raise capital? I think that there are some structural challenges, there are some material challenges, and there are also cultural challenges and hurdles. The first one is access to friends and family capital. A lot of times when you hear the stories of the Jeff Bezos and the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, they kind of start the story, the narrative, when they raise like an amazing round of capital from, either some well-established angels or some well-established VCs. But what tends to be omitted from that story is that many of these individuals had access to friends and family capital. And I'm going to speak for myself, like it was the case for me, and it might be the case for some of you that are watching this, that I didn't have siblings or uncles or aunts or friends to go to get $5,000, $10,000, $100,000 to get really off the ground, which is why it took us quite a bit of time to put out an MVP and put out mobile apps. And other folks are fortunate enough, right, to have access to that initial pool of capital, that initial friends and family capital, which is critical, right, in allowing you to build that MVP and bring something to market that's going to start demonstrating some of those key business metrics and performance metrics that are going to allow you to raise the later round. So speaking personally, like I remember I used to get, and I still, well, not as much, but when I used to fundraise for Wheelie, I would get super frustrated when investors would be like, oh, why did it take you so long? And obviously you don't want to get defensive, but I'm thinking in the back of my head, I'm like, well, access to money is not a given thing for everybody to just be able to go spin out an MVP and figure out your get to product market fit as quickly as others. The second thing that I think is a challenge is building trust. Right. And again, I think trust is the most important component when it comes to people giving you money. And so a lot of times you'll hear from investors that they don't want to meet you. They want to be introduced to you. The reason they say that is because that's the way for them already to kind of validate the deal or validate you, so to say, right? Because when someone introduces you, that person is kind of vouching for you. But the issue at play here, and what happens in a very factual way, is that, like, if you do not come, again, from these family circles, these social circles, these professional circles, these university circles where you have access to the individuals that can introduce you to the folks with capital, then how do you do it, right? And people will be like, well, I'll go to the conferences, go meet people, figure out where they're speaking, do this whole kind of like, detective game of getting in touch. But trust is a very human thing, right? It's not like something that because I do 1, 2, and 3, all of a sudden you're going to trust me, right? And so I feel like a lot of times first-time founders and minority founders are kind of like misled to think that, by playing this little detective game that you're going to be able to get that check or get that introduction, when ultimately, if the person doesn't either believe in you, right, aka trust, they're probably not going to invest. And what I'm kind of speaking to here implicitly is what I refer to as my third point, the tech money culture. So any of you on this call or in this presentation that are first generation immigrants, you're going to identify with this, right? Because we grew up in households, right, where at a very young age, you quickly realize that there's a certain culture at school or at work that might be very different from the culture at home, right? And I remember my parents, for example, whenever I would, or sometimes when I would behave badly, they would make the comment like, hey, you do that at school, you don't do that here, you don't talk to us like that, right? And it's the same thing here, right? There's a culture around in the tech world, and when you're outside of it, you might say or do things that send negative signals to other folks within the space, and you might not even be aware, right, that you said or did something that's interpreted as a negative signal or a signal that you're not ambitious enough or that you might not succeed. And to share with you some examples from my experience that illustrate this is, we were once in a meeting with a big name VC. I'm not going to say the name of the group, but it's one of those that you guys all know. We're talking with the investor, and I forget the detail of how we got to the topic, but the investor asked me and my co-founders, hey, like, what do you guys perceive as success? And Steve, one of my co-founders, who's also a brother from France, from very humble beginnings, said like, hey, if we're able to sell Wheelie for like, 100 million plus or hundreds of millions, that'd be great, right? Later, when my co-founders left the room, that investor told me, don't ever let Steve say something like that to an investor again. And I understood what that individual meant, right? And I understand the economics of VC groups and also the culture. But there's something about it that pissed me off because it's subjective, right? It's not only unicorns that return money for funds. It's not only unicorns that return money for family offices or angel investors. And so it's purely subjective. And the part about it that really kind of like pissed me off is that person was interpreting that because Steve saw $100 million as an exit as a lot of money, that he or we were not ambitious enough, right? We could not bring Wheelie to an outcome, to $1 billion plus outcome. And so what bothers me about that is that like $100 million, $1 million for a lot of people, for the majority of people on this earth, is a lot of money. So for people like me and Steve, like, it is not a representation of our ambition or our characters, the fact that we perceive to be $100 million as a lot of money, because it is relative to a certain extent, right? Even me, I am super fortunate and happy that we're able to raise close to 1.5 million for this venture, because I would have never imagined that I would have been able to get other individuals and institutions to back me with that amount of money. Like, that's a lot of money to a lot of people. And this brings me to my next point, which is the unconscious bias. And a key thing for me to mention is that I'm not trying to paint a picture that, VCs are good or bad, right? Like, I think and I hope and I believe that most people don't necessarily intentionally discriminate, right, against minority founders or women founders. But I definitely think that there's unconscious bias at play. And maybe the best way to analogy to illustrate this is, I look at it like gambling, right? If you're a gambler and every weekend you go to Vegas and you make your money off blackjack, there's a very low likelihood that the next time you're going to go gambling that you're going to start playing roulette, because you haven't made money that way in the past and people around you have not made money that way in the past. So if you're used to investing in the Mark Zuckerberg profile, right, what is the likelihood that someone that comes and pitches you that looks differently, whether it's from an ethnic background, from a professional background, from an experienced background, what's the likelihood that you're going to bet on them, right? Because ultimately, the investment decision is based on trust and is ultimately subjective, right? So it is extremely hard if you do not fit the boxes, right, of the white male Ivy League person to overcome those biases. And so with that said, I do come with a little bit of good news, and particularly in ways that I think that as entrepreneurs, we could start to change this reality and change the world around us. And that's by building sustainable and scalable businesses. So what I mean by building sustainable businesses is essentially that instead of like, as soon as you have an idea, or an MVP, having that reflex of wanting to go raise capital in order to build your business, I think that entrepreneurs should have the reflex of figuring out, how do I start generating revenue from this MVP or from this concept, and how many customers do I need to be able to sustain the operational costs of having, I don't know, you and your founder, 1 or 2 employees, whatever it may be, right? But like, what is that threshold number of revenue or business that we need to generate in order to be able to sustain this operation? And I think that's important for founders to do that, because when you do that, then fundraising becomes an option and not a necessity. And so that means that if you're a minority founder or woman founder, you could go out and, engage in this exercise of fundraising. But if you fail at it, it does not mean that you shut down your company. Because trust me, I've seen so many Techstars companies, Y Combinator companies, even, companies that haven't gone through accelerators, but very brilliant folks that, had to shut down their company, not because they weren't growing, not because they weren't solving a real problem, not because they weren't, bringing in more revenue, but because they were unable to raise that next round of capital. And they got caught in, as I referenced, the hamster wheel. And the reason this is important for us to do this, I think, is because it allows us to change the power dynamic, right? The moment that fundraising becomes more of an option and a necessity, now you're changing the dynamic where the VCs are going to be the ones that are going to start knocking at our door, looking to get in on these deals more than we are going to be the ones reaching out, looking for intros and looking to pitch them, right? And this is important because this fits into what I call regaining our independence as entrepreneurs and as founders. And I've been thinking about this, obviously had a lot of time to reflect, since the beginning of this stay-at-home order. And I've been thinking about what bothered me about the fundraising process. And I came to realize that, fundamentally, I got into launching companies because I needed to pay for school, because I had an idea and I had a need, and I was like, if nobody's going to help me, I'm going to go and solve, and I'm going to take care and build whatever vision I have. But the reality is that, when you're fundraising, it's kind of like you're asking for permission, right? Because you're essentially looking to convince someone who is probably not one of your customers, probably won't use your service, that what you're solving for is valuable, and that it's a big opportunity. And I think that it's important for us as entrepreneurs to build companies, scalable companies, in ways that, VCs don't get to decide which companies live or die, but rather our customers get to do that. And so the last thing I want to leave you with, and the reason why I think this is super important, is, in America, there's this false notion, and you hear it in the political speeches, you see it, through the news, you see it through the movies and the media, but there's this false notion that you succeed on your own, and you fail because you did something wrong. And I've seen so many founders that, because again, they have to shut down their company or they're unable to raise the next round, really take that as a judgment or assessment of themselves, when they really shouldn't be. Because behind raising capital, as I pointed out, there's so many network components at play behind the scenes that it is not a reflection of an entrepreneur, whether or not they're able, a reflection of their intelligence or their ambition or their capabilities, whether or not they're able to raise another round of capital. But I've really seen founders that they really go through it difficult times, right? Because they kind of, add that personal dimension to it. And so I don't think it should be so, right? And I think it's important as entrepreneurs and as founders for us to change the narrative and regain ownership of our narrative. And the reason why this is important is that, we're all hearing the talks right now about, the lack of diversity in tech, particularly since the murder of George Floyd. And, we're hearing these commitments from corporations, from venture capitalists, from different people in the ecosystem that they're going to change, right? That they're going to have more women founders receive funding, or have more women on their boards, or have more Black founders receive funding. And unfortunately, like, I've seen this story before. And I feel like every time there's like an outside social trigger, it kind of comes back to the forefront. But I think the best way for us to actually change what the tech world looks like is by us building sustainable and scalable businesses. Because the moment, right, VCs start missing out on deals, right? Because as founders, we start doing our diligence and asking them, like, well, how many women partners do you have at your fund? How many, Black LPs or Latino LPs do you have participating in your fund? And the moment that they start losing out on these deals, then they're going to start taking it seriously. And then you're going to see that they're going to start acting on diversity as opposed to just making empty promises. But the only way we could do that is if we have the option of turning down their money, or choosing the firm from which we take an investment. That's how we change the power dynamic, and that's how we change what the tech world around us looks like. And the last thing I want to mention is that I think that we can do this because this is not a chicken and the egg situation. Like, this entire ecosystem is built off of us, the entrepreneurs. We're the ones that sit in our beds, or sit in the park, wherever it may be, and don't think about the world as it is, but think about the world as to how we think it should be. So if we intentionally start building companies in ways that we could regain our independence, build sustainable and scalable businesses, make fundraising an option and not a necessity, we could regain the capacity to make of this tech world the diverse world that I think a lot of us aspire for it to be. And I think ultimately that's going to lift, it's going to lift all boats. So that's it with the information I wanted to share with you. If you found this presentation to be valuable or interesting, my only ask for today is to reach out and sign up for my newsletter. I'm going to be sending quarterly newsletters just talking about the projects I'm working on, or even the next ventures that I'm thinking about launching. And so if you're interested, you can shoot me an email at jp@wheelie.us. And with that, Casey, I am going to, give it back to you.
Awesome. Well, that was great. I feel inspired. I'm not even a founder. Let's get to the question. Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and try to answer as many questions as we can here. So if you are tuning in, go ahead and submit them in the Ask a Question box below. Or if you're joining us over on LinkedIn, I'm watching that feed also. So you can go ahead and tag that in the comments and I'll get it over here. So first question is, Levon said, I think the cultural aspect of raising is extremely hard to navigate. So given the stats, 1% of founders backed are Black founders, and the fact that you have a lot of entrepreneurial experience and relationships, they're wondering, why did you not bootstrap or crowdsource your recent business venture?
Because I didn't know. So everything that I'm sharing with you, right, is based off the experience I just had. And maybe to give you a little bit more historical context, I didn't even know about this whole venture capital world. Like, to be honest with you, like I said, like, I got into business because I was really trying to solve a financial problem for myself and trying to pay for school. And it's with the different experiences that I kind of like, I'm the type of person, like, I keep challenging myself to try to do more and bigger. And so with Wheelie, I had just successfully built two, if you want, like, local or regional businesses. And I was like, I want to take a stab at building a national or even like a global business. And as I got involved with Wheelie, and got into the world of tech, that's when I started learning about, like, hey, there are people out there who will write you a check in order to build your vision, right? And then you're reading all the stories. But, hindsight is 2020. I didn't know then what I know now as to, looking behind the curtain past the romantic narrative as to how it really works to be able to raise capital and build a VC-backed venture.
Great. Next question. if I have a company ready for the next growth stage and need funding to grow, how can I start getting that friends and family funding? Or are there other funding options that are not traditional or debt, et cetera?
That's why I like it when people ask the questions, because sometimes I'm like, I'm not sure I understand. You want to repeat it again? Because I'm not sure. I want to make sure I get it right.
If I have a company ready for that next stage and they need funding to grow, how can I get started on that friends and family funding? Or if I can't do that, are there other funding options that, are not traditional?
So I'm going to try to answer this as best as I can, because the question is it's a little broad. But I guess the first kind of like universal rule and thing to know is that your customers are your best investors. So to the point I was making, you should really ask yourself, how do I get this product or this service to a place where I could start generating revenue from it? Because those are the best type of investors to get. And those are customers. And everybody will tell you that across the board, whether those are founders or VCs. When it comes to getting access to capital, there's a multitude of options. They all kind of come with their hurdles and challenges. There are competitions. There are grants. I never did the grant route because I didn't want to write, 20 pages of documentation as to what I was doing. So there's a multitude of ways to bring capital under the roof, so to say. They each come with their pluses and negatives, but ultimately, what I want to advocate for is, get customers. That's the best way to finance your operations.
Okay, great. It kind of leads into the next question that we got from LinkedIn. So John from LinkedIn asks, besides angels, how do startups avoid the necessity of fundraising? Any other tips?
Besides angels, how do startup
avoid the necessity of fundraising?
Do you understand the question? I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think he's just wondering, similar to the last one, maybe, instead of having to need fundraising, are there any other ways that they can grow, besides going to angels, or how they avoid that necessity of needing to fundraise, kind of like you mentioned in your slides?
Yeah, I guess you have to be clever, right? You have to. So one of the challenges that I see a lot of founders go through is, I think a lot of people do a bad job at defining their MVP, their minimal viable product. I made that mistake too. When we first launched Wheelie, we launched a website. If I was to do this again, I would have launched Wheelie with an Excel spreadsheet, because that's enough to figure out who's going somewhere, who needs a ride, and basically from a logistical standpoint, coordinate that. And it would have been enough to even start seeing some money and seeing if you could provide value. So the challenge, right, particularly if you don't have easy access to capital, is really figuring out what is that minimal viable product that I could start executing with in order to demonstrate that there's a business, and also to demonstrate or to start generating revenue, right? Start getting people to pay you for the service. So one way to think about this is, for whatever space you're in, think about how are people currently solving for this problem. And that's probably going to start giving you clues as to what that MVP should look like.
Great. Next question from Zach. Where do you go to learn more about tech? Are there any books or podcasts?
No, so I'm not too much of the book or the podcast. I mean, I read books, but I don't read about tech. I don't read books about tech. I read books about just life and fiction. For me, like, it's really been, I'm a people person. So something I learned to do when I was 19, starting Touche de Finesse, is I've understood early on the importance of bringing people around you that could advise you and guide you. So I always make a very intentional effort to have people around me that are either at later stages than me, on the same path, sometimes earlier stages, people from my industry. But I really make it, I really give a lot of importance to surround yourself with people that could, give you feedback, advice, insights, and preferably like honest, like you could have honest conversations with, and not just kind of the superficial, read a blog and I'm going to give you these 5 tips, go and do them.
Okay. And Zach's also wondering from that, what book do you like about life? Life book.
My top books about life. Well, one's in French, so I don't know if you can understand, but it's called La Vie Devant Soi by Émile Ayard. And the other one, which is probably a more famous one, is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho.
Awesome. All right. And then one more. How can you find investors and get introduced?
How do you find investors and get introduced? Well, I'm trying to get you guys to not look for investors. Seems like I'm failing on my mission right now. Well, that's the whole thing. It's about networks, right? So it's a grind, and that's why it takes so much time, and that's why it's so consuming. Is that if you're not already in that circle, and particularly if you're outside the circle from a social economic standpoint, you are going to have to find people that can introduce you into those spaces. One pragmatic piece of advice I could share with you that I learned with the catering company, and I still do to this day, is whenever I need something, I go through my email contacts, I go through my Facebook contacts, I go through my LinkedIn contacts, I go through my phone contacts, and I put people in 3 different buckets. I put people in the bucket of they have what I need, or I put them in the bucket of they might know someone that has what I need. And then I put people in the bucket that they might have a piece of information that is useful to me. And so by doing that, first you realize that even through your network, you know more people than you think you do, and more valuable people than you think you do. And then basically those conversations allow you to start getting introduced to ultimately the people you want to speak to. And to give you a real life example of this is, you know, one of my boys from college, his dad invested in Wheelie, and it didn't happen until we stopped talking about, you know, we normally have conversations about sports, going out, and women. And then he was like, oh, I saw you posting on Facebook about this thing. What are you working on? I was like, oh, I'm working on this startup. He's like, oh, you should talk to my dad about it. But you see, because I wasn't asking him or speaking to him about my startup, he never thought to make that connection. So it's kind of like you have to reach out to your network and actively let people know what you need and what you're working on.
Great point. Another question came in here from Lanesh. Without funding, how else can you accelerate growth or scaling, as bootstrapping and organic growth might take forever?
So that's a great question. And it makes me realize that maybe I need to do a better job when I'm speaking about that topic. The idea is not to say that you should never seek funding, right? The idea is to seek funding on your terms, because a lot of times what folks don't realize from the outside is that even those companies that raise capital sometimes get horrible terms, right? They don't control their company, you know, whether it's from a board standpoint, whether it's from a product roadmap standpoint, whether it's from like an equity standpoint. Like you have companies that go in IPO, and you would be surprised. Sometimes the founders don't make that much money, but the people who invested later down the line make most of the money. And for me, that's not in the founder's interest when you're spending 16-hour days grinding on your idea. So the point I'm trying to make is not that you should never seek funding, is seek funding on your terms and do it in a way that it's most advantageous for you and your business partners. And the best way to do that is by being able to walk away from a bad deal, and that not, you know, killing your business. Because it's the laws of attraction, right? People want what they can't have. And trust me, I see this at play. Like, and this even happened to us. Like once we got like a superstar investor, you know, a bunch of people we were talking to were trying to get in on our deal to invest in Wheelie. And, you know, Ted from Techstars, I remember him jokingly saying, he's like, isn't it funny? Nothing about your business has changed in the past 24 hours, but because this person that is deemed smart and a superstar invested in Wheelie, now everybody else wants to invest, right? So it's really about changing the power dynamics so that you're able to raise funding on your term, and you could do it in a shorter period of time instead of spending like months on end, you know, pitching and trying to raise capital.
Awesome. All right. If there's any more questions, go ahead and add them. Otherwise, JP, any final advice for our founders watching today?
No, I don't think unless you want to give me like a perimeter within which to give advice. We could talk about a lot of things.
Any motivation to send them off with?
Motivation to send them off with. Oh yeah, I'll share this. If you're either thinking about launching your company, in the process of launching a company, or if you recently had to also shut down your business, this is a great time for entrepreneurs. So, as you're reading in the news, everybody's talking about the new normal, everybody's talking about, feeling gloomy, this and that. I'm excited in times like this. And sometimes I kind of have to shy away from saying it because you sound like an asshole. But the reason I'm excited is because when you have problems, that's when that means there's opportunity. If things were all gravy, then there wouldn't be much to be excited about and much room for opportunity to occur. So I think that, particularly in times like this, where like the larger corporates and the folks that have more capital don't know where the dust is going to settle and they don't know how to move, you might actually be in a better position as a smaller entity or as an individual to go out and try and challenge some of these established companies in some of these spaces. So all this to say, I think the glass is half empty, and I'm super optimistic about the future. And I think that we should all be. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to have a positive impact on our world and our society moving forward.
Awesome. I totally agree. Thank you, JP, for giving us this insight for an hour. Thank you, everyone on Crowdcast, for watching, and over on LinkedIn. The replay will be available right after we end, so you can share the link, come back, rewatch his slides, and learn even more. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, JP.
Ciao.